The old man's hands trembled as he opened the creaking door, revealing the shadowed forest beyond, quiet, yet alive with secrets. The chill of the early dawn bit at his face, but he barely noticed. His eyes, deep-set and weary, scanned the thinning fog that clung to the gnarled branches like ghostly fingers. Somewhere in that dense wilderness, they were waiting. For years, he had lived on the edge of this wilderness, a solitary figure with a purpose no one could understand. He had raised them, wild, fierce, and bound to the rhythms of the earth. The wolf cubs had come into his life as fragile, trembling creatures, their eyes wide with fear and wonder. Now they were grown, their sleek fur shimmering in the faint morning light, their sharp noses twitching with the sense of the forest. But today felt different. The old man's breath came in slow, steady puffs, each one a silent prayer or a warning he couldn't quite name. His gaze lingered on the worn leather collar resting on the rough wooden table, a symbol of a bond that had grown stronger than blood, yet more fragile than glass. The wind whispered through the cracks in the cabin walls, carrying with it a strange unease that settled deep in his chest. He stepped outside, the earth soft beneath his weathered boots, and called softly into the mist. The familiar howls answered, distant but unmistakable. His heart clenched, not with joy, but with a shadow of dread. Something had shifted in the wildness he thought he understood. The cubs, once playful and trusting, now moved with a dangerous grace, their eyes reflecting a hunger that went beyond survival. The old man paused by a fallen tree, tracing the rough bark with a shaky finger. Memories flickered, days spent gathering food, nights spent whispering lullabies under the stars, moments when the world felt whole and safe. Yet beneath those memories, something unraveled, a thread pulled too tight, threatening to snap. As the sun struggled to pierce the grey sky, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The old man's lips pressed into a thin line, knowing that whatever awaited beyond the trees was no longer just wild. It was something unthinkable, and he was the only one who could face it. The old man's cabin sat perched like a forgotten relic at the fringe of the sprawling forest, where the trees whispered ancient secrets and shadows lengthened with each passing hour. Built decades ago from rough-hewn timber and stone quarried nearby, it bore the marks of time. Weathered beams bowed under the weight of countless winters, and moss crept along the roof like a slow-growing blanket. Inside, the air carried the mingled scents of pine smoke, damp earth, and the faint musk of fir. It was a sanctuary shaped by solitude and necessity, a place where man and nature had once merged in harmony. The old man, whose name had long been lost to the few who ever sought him out, was a figure carved from the very wilderness he inhabited. His face, etched deeply by years of sun and wind, told stories beyond words. Eyes the color of storm clouds, framed by creases that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure. His hands, though gnarled and trembling now, had once been steady and sure, capable of coaxing life from the earth and offering gentle care to those who depended on him. He had lived here alone for as long as anyone could remember, a keeper of secrets and a watcher of wolves. The wolf cubs he had raised were not merely animals to him, they were fragments of a dream he had nursed through cold nights and lonely days. When they first arrived at his doorstep, abandoned, fragile, and shivering, he had felt a stirring inside him, a call to nurture something wild yet vulnerable. Over the years, he had fed them with hands both rough and tender, taught them the rhythms of the forest, and listened to their howls as if they were his own voice returned in echo. They had grown strong, sleek, and cunning, their eyes reflecting the fierce intelligence of their kind. But with that growth had come change, subtle and unsettling. The old man sat quietly by the hearth, the flickering fire casting long shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. He traced the rim of a chipped wooden bowl absently, his mind wandering back to moments he both cherished and feared. He remembered the first time he had heard the cub's tentative howls, a sound that had filled the empty spaces of his heart. He recalled the nights spent beneath a canopy of stars, whispering lullabies that only the forest seemed to understand. Yet beneath these memories lurked a silent unease, a tension that had crept into the corners of his world like the slow encroachment of twilight. Lately, the wolf cubs, now no longer cubs but formidable creatures, had begun to shift in their demeanor. Their playful snarls had hardened into something sharper, more calculated. Their eyes, once warm and curious, now held a glint of something darker. A hunger not just for food but for power, for territory, for something the old man could not name without trembling. He noticed how they would pause longer at the cabin's edge, their ears twitching at distant sounds, their bodies coiled like springs ready to strike. They moved with a grace that was both beautiful and threatening, a reminder that wildness could never be fully tamed. This change unsettled the old man deeply, stirring a conflict within him that he struggled to contain. He had raised these creatures with love, with hope that they would remain tethered to him by more than instinct. But nature, he knew, was a force beyond human will, a force that could unravel even the most carefully woven bonds. The leather collar on the table was a symbol of that bond, a fragile loop of connection between man and beast, love and wildness. Yet, even as he stared at it, he sensed its weakness. The collar might hold for now, but for how much longer? Outside, the forest seemed to press inward, the trees standing like silent sentinels guarding secrets the old man was only beginning to grasp. He remembered the stories whispered by the wind, tales of wolves that had turned on those who raised them, of the delicate balance between trust and betrayal. He had dismissed them once, believing in the purity of his mission, but doubt had begun to seep into his bones like a slow poison. He found himself watching the cubs with a mixture of pride and apprehension, searching their eyes for the spark of loyalty that had once been so certain. In the stillness of the morning, the old man felt a tightening in his chest, a physical ache that spoke of loss yet to come. He pressed his palm against the rough bark of a nearby tree, its surface cool and unyielding beneath his fingers. This forest was his home, his refuge, yet it was also a place of relentless change, a place where survival demanded adaptation, and where love could be both a shield and a vulnerability. He could not shake the feeling that the line between protector and prey was blurring, that the wolves he had raised were edging toward a destiny he had feared but never dared to confront. As he rose and stepped back into the fading mist, the old man carried with him the weight of unspoken fears and fragile hopes. The forest held its breath, and somewhere deep within its shadows, the wolf cubs moved with a purpose that was no longer entirely his to command. The old man's gaze lingered on their silhouettes, lit by the pale light of dawn, and for the first time he wondered if the bond they shared might be broken, not by violence or betrayal, but by the inexorable pull of the wild itself. The morning stretched on, heavy and still, as the old man lingered at the cabin's threshold, eyes straining toward the dim shapes moving beyond the tree line. The wolf pack was out there, just beyond reach, their silhouettes blending with the mist like shadows born of the earth itself. But something had shifted in their stance, in the way they held themselves, an unfamiliar sharpness, a silent assertion that unsettled him more than any growl or snarl ever could. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake the restless weight that had settled deep within his chest. His mind flickered to the last time he had seen them close, a rare moment when they had approached without the usual wariness, their eyes soft for a brief instant. But even then, there had been a flicker of something unreadable, a hesitation that didn't belong. Was it a flicker of doubt, or something darker, a hidden fracture in the fragile trust they shared? In the quiet that followed, a sudden rustle nearby brought his attention sharply back to the present. He turned, heart-skipping, to find one of the younger wolves, a sleek, silver-coated female emerging cautiously from the underbrush. She paused at the cabin's edge, ears flicking, nostrils flaring as if caught between two worlds. Her eyes met his for a long moment, intense and inscrutable, before she slipped back into the shadows without a sound. That fleeting exchange left the old man with a strange, gnawing unease. It was as if she had been waiting to see how he would react, testing the limits of their fragile connection. Her retreat felt deliberate, a silent challenge that echoed in the hollow spaces of his heart. Had she changed? Had the wildness within her grown too large, too insistent, to be held by the bonds he had taught her? He retreated inside, closing the door softly behind him, but the air felt heavier now, thick with unspoken tension. The fire in the hearth sputtered, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. He sat down slowly, fingers curling around the worn armrest of his chair, trying to steady the storm of thoughts swirling inside his head. Memories surfaced unbidden, not of peaceful nights or shared warmth, but of a moment long buried, a sudden inexplicable growl that had erupted from one of the cubs during a rare visit from a village child. The old man had dismissed it then, a moment of wildness misunderstood, but now it returned with a sharper edge. Was that growl a warning? A glimpse of something lurking beneath the surface, waiting to break free? His gaze dropped to the leather collar on the table once more, but this time his fingers hesitated to touch it. The symbol of connection suddenly felt fragile in a different way, less like a promise and more like a barrier, a fragile tether stretched thin over an abyss. The old man wondered if the wolves saw it as a chain rather than a bond, a reminder of captivity rather than care. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose window panes and carrying with it faint, unsettling sounds, the rustling of leaves, a distant snap of a twig, the barely audible whisper of movement that could have been anything or nothing. The old man's senses sharpened, muscles tensing instinctively. The forest was alive, yes, but it was also watching, waiting, shifting in ways he could no longer predict. A sudden pang of doubt cut through him. Had he truly known these creatures at all? Or had the ones he raised been shadows of what the forest demanded they become? The line between nurture and nature blurred further, leaving him suspended in a liminal space where love and fear tangled into a knot impossible to unravel. As twilight edged closer, the old man found himself drawn back to the window, eyes scanning the deepening gloom. There, barely visible through the thickening mist, the wolves moved with a strange synchronization, an eerie unity that felt less like family and more like something organized, purposeful, even strategic. Their eyes glinted with an intelligence that was no longer merely animal, but something more calculating, more deliberate. He recalled a fleeting glimpse from the night before, a low, mournful howl that had carried a strange cadence, almost like a call or a command. It had unsettled him deeply, stirring a primal caution that chilled his bones. Was it a signal to him, or a message between the wolves themselves, sealed in a language he could no longer decipher? The old man's breath hitched as a sudden noise at the back of the cabin made him spin around. Nothing was there but the swaying branches and the whispering wind. Yet, in that empty space, he felt the unmistakable weight of unseen eyes, watching, judging, waiting. A quiet despair settled over him, not the despair of defeat but of profound uncertainty. The wolves he had raised were no longer merely wild animals, nor simple companions. They were becoming something else, something beyond his grasp. And in the shifting shadows of the forest, he feared that the unthinkable was no longer a distant threat, but an imminent presence creeping ever closer. As night enveloped the world outside, the old man sat in the dim glow of the firelight, caught between hope and dread. The fragile thread of connection between man and beast stretched taut, trembling on the edge of a fracture he could neither mend nor fully understand. Somewhere beyond the trees, the wolf pack was moving again, silent, watchful, and waiting for the moment when the old man's world would change forever. The old man's restless night had been punctuated by the distant chorus of howls, fragments of sound that seemed to tease and taunt from the depths of the forest. By dawn, he was already on his feet, drawn outside by a gnawing unease he couldn't shake. The mist still clung low to the ground, weaving between the trees like a living shroud. But this morning the air held a sharper edge, a tension that prickled beneath his skin. He moved with cautious purpose along the narrow path that wound from his cabin deeper into the woods, the familiar crunch of twigs and leaves muffled beneath a soft blanket of frost. His breath rose in pale clouds, each exhale a silent question. The wolf pack was out there, he knew, somewhere just beyond sight. Yet this time, there was more than just distance between them. There was a silence, too deliberate, too measured to be natural. As he rounded a bend near a cluster of ancient pines, the old man froze. There, in a small clearing bathed in weak sunlight, lay something that stopped his heart mid-beat. The remains of a deer, freshly torn apart, scattered in jagged pieces across the frost-hardened earth. But it wasn't the kill itself that unsettled him. It was what surrounded it. The wolf cubs, no, the wolves now, were gathered not as a family, but as a pack united by something far more calculated. Their eyes, usually alert but affectionate, flicked up to meet his with a cold precision that felt alien. The silver-coated female from the previous day stood apart, her gaze locked on him with a fierce intensity that bordered on defiance. Around her, the others shifted uneasily, their bodies taut and restless. He swallowed hard, every muscle taut with a sudden surge of adrenaline. The wolves had always been wild, yes, but this was different. Their hunting was efficient, ruthless even, but it was more than survival. It was a display of control, a silent assertion of dominance. The old man's mind raced. Had they been forming a hierarchy without him? Had the bond he thought unbreakable been quietly dissolving beneath the surface? Suddenly, a low growl rumbled through the clearing, deep and resonant. The silver female moved closer, her hackles raised, teeth bared, not at him, but at a shadow shifting at the edge of the trees. The old man's eyes followed, heart pounding, as a figure emerged, a man, younger, dressed in worn outdoor clothes, carrying a rifle slung casually over his shoulder. The stranger's gaze was sharp, unreadable, but not hostile. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said quietly, stepping forward with deliberate calm. "I've been tracking this pack for weeks now." His eyes flicked to the wolves, assessing them with a mixture of respect and wariness. "They're not like others. They're smarter, more organized." The old man's grip tightened on the rough bark of a nearby tree. "I raised them," he said, voice rough with emotion, "from cubs." The stranger nodded slowly. "I know. I've heard stories about the man who raised wolves, but they're changing." "You're not the only one watching them." A bitter laugh escaped the old man's lips. "Changing, I've seen it myself. Their eyes, there's something in them I don't understand." The man stepped closer, lowering his rifle just enough to show no threat. "They're adapting to the pressures around them. The forest isn't what it used to be. There are more hunters, less game. The wolves are learning to survive in ways we don't expect." The realization hit the old man like a blow. It wasn't just the wolves' nature shifting, it was the environment reshaping them, forcing evolution not through slow seasons, but through immediate survival. The delicate balance he had nurtured was being upended by forces beyond his control. "Why are you here?" he asked, voice trembling. "I'm part of a conservation group," the man replied. "We've been monitoring wolf populations, trying to understand how they're coping with human encroachment. Your pack is unique because of you, because of how they were raised. But that uniqueness makes them unpredictable." The old man's eyes narrowed. "Unpredictable how?" The stranger hesitated, then spoke with a gravity that chilled the air. "They're forming new social bonds, alliances that don't always follow the rules of the wild. There are signs of aggressive behavior, not just toward prey, but toward anything that threatens their territory, and they're testing boundaries with humans." A cold dread settled over the old man. The wolves he had raised, once symbols of hope and connection, were becoming something far more dangerous. The very bond he had forged, the collars, the care, the whispered promises under the stars, might be the thing that set them apart and made them vulnerable to new threats, or worse, turned them into a force that could no longer be controlled. The silver female stepped forward again, her gaze flicking between the two men. She let out a low, warning growl, the sound vibrating deep in her chest. It was a reminder that the forest belonged to her, and that the old man's presence here was no longer a given. The old man looked down at the leather collar he still held loosely in his hand. It was no longer just a symbol of their bond. It was a fragile artifact of a past that was slipping away. The wolves were no longer the cubs he had raised with hope and tenderness. They were survivors shaped by a harsher reality, and that reality was closing in fast. As the stranger prepared to leave, he offered one last piece of advice. "You need to be ready. Things are changing, and if you're not careful, that unthinkable moment you feared might come sooner than you expect." Left alone in the clearing, the old man felt the weight of those words settle deep within him. The wolves stirred, their forms blending once more into the mist and shadow. The forest around him was no longer just a place of refuge. It was a crucible of survival, where old bonds might be broken and new, unforeseen dangers awaited. He turned slowly back toward his cabin, the cold morning air biting sharper now, carrying the heavy scent of change. The unthinkable was no longer just a distant shadow lurking at the edges of his world. It was here, alive, watching, and waiting for him to face what came next. The old man stood motionless in the clearing, the stranger's words echoing in his chest like a relentless drumbeat. The wolves had retreated into the shadows, their forms dissolving into the mist like fading ghosts, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the thick forest air. His fingers tightened around the leather collar, the supple, worn leather suddenly cold and foreign in his grasp. A slow shiver crawled up his spine, not from the chill but from the dizzying weight of what he had just heard. He closed his eyes, drawing in a ragged breath that seemed too shallow, too small to fill the cavernous ache inside. The forest around him was unnervingly still, as if it too was caught in a fragile pause, holding its breath along with him. His mind raced, yet stalled, tumbling over itself in fragments of disbelief and reluctant acceptance. They're not like others. They're smarter, more organized. The phrase gnawed at him, carving away at the foundation of everything he had believed. For years, he had nurtured them with a quiet certainty, convinced that love and patience could bridge the vast gulf between wildness and humanity. But now that certainty felt like brittle glass, shattered by an unseen hand. His chest tightened, a slow, persistent ache that blossomed into a hollow pit. Unpredictable behavior, testing boundaries with humans. The words refused to settle peacefully in his mind. He pictured the cubs as they once were, clumsy, trusting, eyes bright with innocence, and contrasted that with the sharp, cold gaze of the silver female, her growl a warning he could no longer ignore. Was this the same creature? Had the wild carved away the boyish hope he'd held onto so tightly? His hands trembled, fingers flexing involuntarily as if trying to grasp the intangible threads of his unraveling world. He forced himself to look down at the collar again, tracing its worn edges with a trembling thumb. It was meant to be a symbol of connection, a fragile loop binding him to these wild souls, but now it felt more like a shackle, a reminder of a past innocence slipping beyond reach. The old man's breath hitched, and he swallowed hard, fighting the rising tide of emotion that threatened to spill over. Anger flickered briefly, anger at nature's cruelty, at the harshness of reality that twisted his carefully woven dreams into something unrecognizable. But it was quickly replaced by a profound grief, raw and gnawing, that settled deep in his bones like winter's chill. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, as if the earth beneath him might betray his balance. His gaze drifted upward, meeting the tangled canopy where pale sunlight struggled to break through the dense leaves. The forest seemed different now, less a sanctuary and more a cage, its shadows thick with secrets he had yet to unravel. A sudden gust stirred the fallen leaves at his feet, sending a cascade of amber and crimson spiraling into the air. The rustling echoed like whispered accusations, ghostly reminders of promises made and broken. His heart pounded painfully in his chest, the rhythm uneven and desperate. He was caught between worlds, the man who had raised cubs with a hopeful heart, and the man forced to reckon with the untamable wildness they had become. Memories flickered unbidden, sharp and bittersweet. The nights spent beneath the stars, the soft lullabies murmured into the quiet darkness, the warmth of fur pressed against his side, all now tinged with a surreal distance. Had he been fooling himself? Had the wolves ever truly belonged to him, or had he been merely a caretaker, a fleeting presence in their relentless march towards survival? His lips pressed into a thin line, the silence stretching taut between each breath. He found himself pacing slowly, the crunch of frost underfoot the only sound breaking the heavy quiet. Each step seemed to echo a question without answer. What had he missed? Where had the bond slipped away? His eyes flickered to the trees lining the clearing, their gnarled branches reaching skyward like grasping fingers. The forest was no longer just a backdrop. It was an active participant in this unfolding reckoning, its ancient presence indifferent yet unforgiving. The old man imagined the wolves moving through that shadowed maze, silent and purposeful, their allegiance shifting like the shifting light. He stopped abruptly, breath shallow, chest tight. For a moment the world seemed to tilt, and he leaned heavily against a rough-hewn tree trunk, fingers digging into the bark as if to anchor himself. The texture was rough, real, a stark contrast to the intangible fears swirling within. His mind spun with fragmented thoughts, each more unsettling than the last. Was the silver female's defiance a rejection of him? Had the pack's loyalty fractured beneath his feet, replaced by a new order he couldn't comprehend? Could he still reach them? Or had the wildness claimed them entirely? His gaze fell to the collar once more, and for the first time, doubt blossomed fully in his heart. What if the bond he thought inviolable was nothing more than a fragile illusion? What if love and nurture were insufficient shields against the raw, unforgiving tides of nature? A sudden bitterness rose within him, sharp and unwelcome. He had believed himself a guardian, a bridge between two worlds. Now he felt like a stranger cast out, watching helplessly as the creatures he had raised slipped beyond his grasp. That thought was a wound, raw and bleeding, threatening to consume the fragile hope he had clung to for so long. Yet beneath the despair, a flicker of resolve stirred, faint but undeniable. He was not ready to surrender, to accept that the wolves were lost to him completely. But the path forward was shrouded in uncertainty, tangled with shadows he could not yet name. The old man's breath hitched again, and he exhaled slowly, the cold air burning his lungs. He wiped a trembling hand across his weathered face, the rough fabric of his sleeve catching on the faint lines of sweat and frost. His movements were slow, measured, as if each gesture was a small act of defiance against the encroaching darkness. He glanced once more toward the forest's edge, where the mist curled like spectral fingers. Somewhere beyond that shifting veil, the wolves waited, no longer cubs, no longer simply creatures of the wild, but something transformed, something that both terrified and fascinated him. The old man's eyes narrowed, shadows deepening beneath their storm-gray depths. The weight of the stranger's warning settled heavily upon him, but beneath it lay something more complex, a fragile thread of understanding, a dawning awareness that the world he had known was changing irrevocably. Silence stretched between him and the forest, a moment suspended in time. The collar rested in his palm, a fragile relic of a past that was slipping fast. His heart pounded unevenly, a steady drumbeat of fear, grief, and a desperate, quiet hope. He was no longer the man who had simply raised wolf cubs. He was a witness to their becoming, caught between the fading past and an uncertain future, where the unthinkable was no longer a distant shadow, but a presence awakening in the depths of the wild. The old man sat alone in the dim light of his cabin, the fading embers of the hearth casting flickering shadows across the worn walls. The silence was heavy, a weight pressing against his chest that no breath could ease. Outside, the forest murmured softly, the wind threading through the branches like a whispered lament. Inside, he was adrift, caught between memories that refused to rest and a present that felt unsteady beneath his feet. His fingers trembled as they brushed against the leather collar resting on the wooden table. Their symbol, once a token of trust and unity, now a relic of a fragile past. The smooth, worn surface held the faint scent of fur and earth, a reminder of nights spent cradling trembling cubs beneath the stars. Yet beneath that memory lay a deeper ache, one that had been growing quietly, like a shadow stretching long and dark. He closed his eyes, and images flooded in unbidden. The tender weight of a cub curled against his side, soft breaths mingling with the cool night air. Laughter shared under a canopy of constellations, the lullabies whispered into the wilderness. But then the memories twisted, snarls that shattered the quiet, eyes once warm now cold and calculating, the sudden, sharp fissures that had cracked the foundation of their bond. A slow, bitter tide of guilt rose within him, not for what he had done, but for what he had failed to see, for the moments when doubt had whispered silently, drowned beneath hope and stubborn faith. Had he ignored the signs, the flicker of wildness too fierce to be tamed, the restless glances toward the forest edge? His heart ached with the weight of those silent warnings, now impossible to overlook. Yet alongside guilt was a strange relief, a fragile breath of clarity breaking through the fog. He was not alone in this unraveling. The stranger's words had confirmed what his instincts had long feared. The wolves were changing, shaped by forces beyond his control. It was a cruel truth, but a truth nonetheless. To hold on too tightly, to deny the wildness within them, would have been a greater betrayal than any he could admit. His thoughts spiraled, tangled and unresolved as he rose slowly and paced the cabin's narrow floor. The creak of weathered boards beneath his boots echoed in the quiet, a steady rhythm against the chaos inside. Each step felt like a small act of defiance, against the pull of despair, against the fading illusion that he could still command a world now slipping through his fingers. He passed by a cracked mirror hanging near the doorway, its surface dull and fractured. For a moment he hesitated, then turned away, unwilling to confront the reflection that bore the lines of time and worry etched deep into his face. The man staring back was a stranger in many ways, a guardian undone by the wildness he sought to nurture, a heart stretched thin between love and loss. A sudden wave of loneliness washed over him, raw and unrelenting. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The walls held echoes of laughter and whispered promises, but also the ghosts of what had slipped away. The wolves' absence was palpable, a presence felt in the empty space where trust had once lived. He reached out, fingers grazing the rough bark of a wooden chair, seeking some tangible anchor in the shifting tides of his mind. The scent of pine smoke still lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the damp earthiness that seeped through the cracks in the cabin's frame. It was a scent that spoke of home, of seasons turning quietly beyond the glass. But now, even the familiar smells carried a bittersweet edge, a reminder that the world he knew was changing, and with it, the man he thought he had been. Memories surfaced again, fragmented and elusive. The first time the cubs had arrived, shivering and wide-eyed, their fragile lives entrusted to his care. The nights spent watching over them, the delicate balance of nurturing strength without extinguishing the wild spark. He recalled the lullabies, the whispered names, the soft touch of fur beneath his rough hands, all moments frozen in time, now tinged with a haunting distance. He thought of family, what it meant, and what it had meant for him. The wolves had been more than animals. They were his kin, his legacy. Yet that legacy now felt uncertain, blurred by the relentless forces that shaped the forest and those who inhabited it. Was family defined by blood, by nurture, or by something more elusive, something that could shift and fracture like the forest shadows at dusk? A sudden stillness settled over the cabin, the kind that stretches thin and deep, like the final note of a song fading into silence. The old man sank slowly into a creaking chair, the leather collar still resting heavy in his palm. He stared down at it, the symbol of all he had tried to hold on to, and felt the weight of its fragility keenly. It was a reminder that bonds, no matter how fiercely forged, could bend, crack, and sometimes break. His breath came slow and steady, a fragile tether to the moment. The doubts and fears mingled with a stubborn thread of hope, stubborn as moss clinging to stone. Hope that maybe, somehow, the wildness within the wolves and himself could find a new balance. Not a return to what once was, but a transformation into something different, something yet to be understood. The night deepened outside, the forest breathing softly against the cabin walls. Somewhere beyond, the wolves moved like shadows, their presence a quiet pulse in the darkness. The old man closed his eyes once more, letting the silence wrap around him like a fragile cloak. He was no longer the man who had raised cubs with certainty and ease. He was something else now, a keeper of memories, a witness to change, a soul caught between past and future. And in that quiet, suspended space, he understood that the unthinkable was not just an event waiting in the wings. It was a shifting tide within himself, a reckoning that would shape the rest of his days. The path ahead was unclear, veiled in mist and shadow, but it was a path he could no longer deny. For now, there was only stillness. Only the slow, steady beat of a heart, learning to carry both grief and hope, doubt and instinct, loss and the fragile promise of renewal. The night had settled over the forest like a heavy, suffocating blanket, and the old man felt it pressing in on all sides. The cabin's walls creaked under the weight of the wind that had risen without warning, rattling loose shutters and sending a cold draft swirling through the dim interior. Outside, the trees groaned and whispered secrets he no longer trusted. The fragile calm he had clung to since the stranger's visit was slipping through his fingers, unraveling like the frayed edges of the leather collar in his hand. He sat hunched over the table, eyes fixed on the worn band as if it might offer answers. But the collar was silent, a mute testament to a bond strained beyond recognition. The wolf pack, his wolves, were no longer the creatures of trust and tenderness he had raised. They had transformed into something else, something primal, unpredictable, and dangerous. The old man's heart pounded unevenly, a drumbeat of fear and defiance tangled into one. Suddenly, a sharp knock shattered the stillness, so sudden and loud it made him start and nearly drop the collar. He froze, breath caught in his throat, his weathered hands trembling. Another knock, this time more insistent, almost urgent. The old man rose slowly, muscles stiff, and crossed the room with cautious steps. The wind howled outside, rattling the doorframe as if urging him to stay away, to shut out whatever waited beyond. With a trembling hand, he opened the door just a crack. Standing there, framed by the swirling mist and the dark silhouette of the forest, was the silver-coated female wolf. Her eyes shone like twin embers, fierce and unyielding, but behind that intensity there was something else, an almost human desperation that pierced the old man's soul. He swallowed hard, voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" The wolf's gaze didn't waver. She stepped forward, nose twitching as if weighing the scent of the man she once trusted. Then, without warning, she dropped to her haunches and let out a low, urgent growl, a sound that vibrated through the thin cabin walls like a warning bell. The old man's heart clenched. This was no longer a companion's call, but a signal of warning, of alarm. Before he could react, a sudden movement behind the wolf caught his eye. Another figure emerged from the shadows, the younger man from the clearing, the stranger with the rifle. He stepped forward, eyes dark and unreadable beneath a hood pulled low against the biting wind. "I'm sorry to intrude again," the stranger said, voice calm but edged with urgency. "But you need to listen. The pack isn't just changing. They're restless, dangerous, and they've started moving closer to the edges of the forest near the village." The old man's eyes narrowed, a wave of anger and fear surging through him. "Closer? How close?" The stranger's gaze flicked to the wolf, then back to the old man. "Too close. Last night there were sightings, livestock taken, strange howls echoing near homes. The villagers are scared. They're talking about hunting the pack down." The old man's breath hitched. "They don't understand. They never did. They never will," the stranger replied grimly. "And neither do you, not anymore." The wolf's growl deepened, a low rumble that seemed to shake the very floorboards beneath their feet. She rose and paced restlessly near the door, ears flicking toward the forest, as if sensing a threat beyond human sight. The old man's gaze followed her, unease knotting in his stomach. "Why did you come back?" he asked the stranger, voice rough with emotion. "What more do you want from me?" The stranger's eyes flashed with something unreadable, concern, resentment. "I want you to prepare, to face what's coming. The wolves are no longer just animals you raised. They've become a force, and forces like that don't wait for permission. They take what they need." The old man's jaw tightened. For years, he had believed himself the guardian, the keeper of a fragile peace between man and wild. Now that peace was crumbling, and he was left grasping at shadows. Suddenly, the wolf barked sharply, a sound that cracked the tension like a whip. The old man spun toward the window just as a shadow darted through the trees, a blur too swift and purposeful to be anything but one of his wolves. His heart thundered in his chest. They were watching him, testing the boundaries he had once set. He turned back to the stranger, voice trembling but fierce. "What am I supposed to do? They're my family." The stranger's face softened, but his words were hard as stone. "Sometimes family becomes something you have to let go of. Sometimes survival means making choices you never thought you could." The old man's hands clenched into fists. "I won't abandon them. Not now. Not ever." A silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Outside, the wind had grown into a howling storm, rattling the cabin and tossing leaves in frantic spirals. The wolf paced near the door, restless, her eyes glowing with a wild, untamed light. And then, without warning, the door burst open, slammed against the wall, and a gust of cold air rushed in, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of blood and earth. The pack had come. No longer distant shadows, no longer timid cubs. They were here, at the threshold of the old man's sanctuary, and the fragile world he had built was beginning to fracture. His breath caught, chest tightening with a surge of panic and resolve. The unthinkable wasn't just approaching, it was breaking through. The wolves he'd raised, the bond he'd treasured, the man he thought he was, all were colliding in a storm that threatened to tear him apart. He staggered back, the collar slipping from his grasp and falling to the floor with a dull thud. The old man's eyes darted between the stranger, the wolf, and the shadows beyond the broken door. His voice cracked as he demanded, "What now? What do we do when the wild won't be tamed? When the family you raise turns into something you can't control?" The stranger's eyes held a hard truth. You survive. You fight. You decide what kind of man you're willing to be. Outside, the wolves howled, a chorus rising in the tempest, wild and unyielding. The old man stood trembling amid the chaos, caught in the eye of a storm that was no longer just of nature, but of the heart, the soul, and the uncharted territories where love and fear entwined in a dangerous dance. And deep within him, something shattered. The old man's gaze lingered on the broken leather collar lying on the floor, its torn edges mottled with dirt and faint, dark stains. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, heavier than the storm raging beyond the shattered door. The wolves' howls twisted through the night like a chorus of warning and lament, reverberating through the hollow spaces inside his chest. But it wasn't just the raw wildness outside that gripped him. It was the sudden, piercing clarity that struck like a shard of ice, slicing through years of memories and assumptions. He sank slowly onto the creaking wooden chair by the hearth, still damp from the draft that had swept in moments before. His hands trembled as they reached for the collar, fingers brushing over the cracked leather, tracing its familiar grooves. That collar had been more than a token. It had been a promise, a fragile, aching promise between man and beast. Yet now, in the cold light of this unraveling, it felt like a relic of a past he had misunderstood. His mind rewound, pulling at threads woven deep in the fabric of his solitude. There had been subtle signs, whispers buried beneath the everyday. The silver female's wary glances, the pack's shifting formations, the sudden, inexplicable growls that he had once dismissed as mere instinct. But even more than that, a memory surfaced, a fragment he had so carefully tucked away. The night the cubs first arrived, shivering and silent at his doorstep, he had thought them abandoned by fate, forgotten by the forest. Yet now, the image flickered with a new hue. He remembered the stranger's words, the quiet assertion that the wolves were changing not just because of nature, but because of something he had set in motion, something he had failed to see in time. The pack's intelligence, their strategic movements, their testing of boundaries. They were not merely adaptations to the forest's encroaching dangers, they were echoes of something else, something born from the intersection of nurture and wildness, human and animal. Suddenly, the old man's breath caught. It was not just the wolves who had been shaped by this fragile bond. He himself had been altered, unknowingly becoming part of a cycle far more complex and fraught than he had imagined. The wolves had mirrored his own isolation, his own hunger for connection in a world that had long since turned its back on him. A flash of memory shattered the quiet. A night long ago, beneath a canopy of stars stained with silver light, the old man had hummed a lullaby, a simple, aching melody he hadn't thought of in years. The cubs, curled close, had listened with wide eyes, their small bodies trembling not from cold, but from something deeper, a yearning, a silent plea for belonging. But there had been one cub who did not settle, whose eyes held a flicker of defiance even then. The silver female. He had seen in her something wild beyond patience, a spark that refused to be quelled. At the time, it had seemed a challenge, a test of his resolve. Now it felt like a warning he had ignored. The old man's gaze drifted to the cracked mirror near the door, its fractured surface reflecting the dim firelight and the shadowed lines of his face. For years, He had seen himself as a guardian, a bridge between two worlds, steady and sure. But the reflection stared back with unfamiliar eyes, tired and uncertain, marked by a fracture that ran deeper than skin. And then, a new realization dawned, one that unsettled him more than the wolf's restlessness. The stranger, the man with the rifle, had not simply appeared by chance. There was a history there, a connection veiled in the cautious respect and guarded words exchanged in the clearing. The old man recalled fragments from a conversation, subtle hints in the stranger's tone, the way his eyes flickered when speaking of the pack's evolution. Had the stranger been tracking the wolves long before their recent encounters? Had he, too, been part of the story all along, not an outsider, but a shadow tethered to the old man's past, to the very secrets the forest whispered? The old man's heart clenched with a bitter twist. He had thought himself alone in his vigil, the solitary keeper of a fading bond. But now the threads tangled in unexpected ways. The stranger was not just a messenger of warning, but a player in the unfolding drama, a reminder that the line between ally and adversary might be thinner than the worn leather collar he once trusted. His thoughts spiraled toward the villagers, their fear-soaked whispers of hunts and retribution. The wolves' encroachment had stirred unease, but beneath that fear lay a deeper, unspoken tension, a collective memory of boundaries crossed and balances upset. The old man realized at Tilkind with a sinking certainty that he had been blind to the consequences of his own desires. In raising the cubs, he had not only nurtured wildness, he had provoked a reckoning between the natural world and the human one, a fracture now bleeding into both. He traced the worn edges of the collar again, feeling its roughness bite into his skin like a reminder of promises made and broken. The pack was no longer a family bound by affection and trust, but a force shaped by survival, intelligence, and something that resembled ambition. The silver female's defiance was not mere rebellion. It was a declaration of a new order, one that might no longer include the old man. A low rumble of thunder rolled through the forest, jolting him back to the present. Outside, the wolves stirred, their silhouettes melding with the shadows beyond the cabin walls. The storm was no longer just in the sky. It was inside him, a tempest of doubt, grief, and reluctant understanding. He realized now that the unthinkable was not an event waiting in the future, but a current flowing through his veins and theirs. The man who had raised cubs was caught in a transformation he could neither halt nor fully comprehend, a liminal space where love and wildness collided, and where every choice carried weight beyond measure. The old man's breath came slow, steady, as he rose from the chair, the collar slipping silently from his fingers to the floor once more. His eyes met the darkened forest through the cracked window pane, and for the first time, he saw himself reflected not just in the mirror, but in the eyes of the wolves, fractured, wild, and irrevocably changed. He whispered into the gathering storm, a plea and a promise intertwined. "We are bound, you and I, not by chains, but by the blood of this earth and the shadows we carry." And as the wolves howled again, the old man knew that the path forward would demand sacrifices he had yet to face, and truths he had only just begun to understand. The old man sat alone at the edge of the clearing, the chill night air pressing against his skin like a thin, unyielding veil. The fire before him had long since died to embers, their faint glow barely illuminating the rough-hewn stones that circled the pit. Around him, the forest loomed vast and silent, shadows pooling beneath the towering pines like ink spilled over parchment. Somewhere deep within that darkness, the wolves moved, no longer his cubs, no longer the creatures he thought he knew. His hands trembled as he reached for the leather collar lying beside him, its cracked surface rough beneath his fingertips. He traced the worn edges absently, each touch a fragile tether to a past slipping relentlessly away. The scent of earth and fur clung faintly to the leather, mingling with the harsh bite of cold. It was a relic now, a symbol fractured beyond repair. "This is no longer home," he thought, the words falling between his breath like broken glass. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and raw. The forest, once a sanctuary woven from memory and quiet trust, now felt like a cage, an expanse that swallowed hope and echoed only with the hollow sound of loss. He closed his eyes, trying to summon the warmth of those early days. The cubs, fragile and trembling beneath the stars, trusting him with their lives. The lullabies whispered softly into the night, promises spoken in a language older than words. But those memories were ghosts now, flickering, distant, impossible to grasp without pain. A gust of wind stirred the fallen leaves at his feet, sending them swirling in restless spirals. The sound was sharp, brittle, like the fragile threads of the bond he had once believed unbreakable snapping quietly in the cold. His heart clenched, a sudden ache that spread through his chest and settled like a stone. He opened his eyes slowly, the darkness pressing close. Somewhere beyond the trees, a low, mournful howl rose, a sound both familiar and terrifyingly foreign. It carried a cadence that spoke of a new order, a force reshaped by hunger and the harsh demands of survival. The old man's breath hitched. That howl was no longer a call for connection, but a challenge issued from the depths of the wild. He rose unsteadily, the cold biting through his threadbare coat as he paced the narrow space between the fire pit and the darkened forest. Each step echoed with the weight of unsaid words and broken promises. His mind churned, tangled in a knot of doubt and despair. Was I ever truly their guardian? The question landed heavy in the silence, unanswered and unanswerable. The old man stopped and pressed his palm against the rough bark of a nearby tree. The texture was harsh, grounding him in the moment, even as his thoughts spiraled. He could feel the pulse of the earth beneath his fingers, the relentless, indifferent heartbeat of the wilderness that had shaped both him and the wolves. But it was a heartbeat that no longer seemed to include him. A sudden rustle behind him made him start. He turned sharply, heart pounding, but saw only the empty darkness between the trunks. The wind whispered again, its voice a cold reminder of the solitude he now inhabited. There was no comfort here, only the vast, unyielding expanse of a world that had shifted beneath his feet. He sank back onto the fallen log, the rough wood biting through his thin clothing. His hands shook as he clasped them together, fingers entwining in a desperate attempt to hold onto something solid. The collar rested in his lap, a fragile emblem of a bond that had unraveled beyond repair. His gaze drifted upward, to the sky where the stars blinked cold and distant. The constellations were the same ones he had once traced with a hopeful heart, but tonight they felt like silent witnesses to a reckoning he had long feared. The night stretched endlessly, vast and empty, swallowing him whole. A single tear traced a cold path down his weathered cheek, its presence startling in its quiet defiance. He wiped it away quickly, ashamed of the vulnerability it betrayed. I cannot afford weakness, not now. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as the weight of what lay ahead settled deep within him. The wolves were no longer the animals he had raised with patience and love. They had become something else, something fierce, unpredictable, and beyond his control. The fragile thread that had bound them was fraying fast, unraveling under the pressure of wildness and survival. He thought of the stranger's warning, the grave urgency in his voice. Prepare yourself. The words echoed in his mind, heavy with unspoken consequences. The old man knew, with a sinking certainty, that there was no turning back. The path he stood upon was narrow and treacherous, leading toward a future that would demand sacrifices he had never imagined. His fingers tightened around the collar, nails digging into the worn leather as if to anchor himself. I must face this. I must face them. The resolve was quiet but fierce, a final, fragile stand against the encroaching darkness. The forest seemed to lean in closer, its breath cold against his skin. A distant howl rose again, sharp and urgent, stirring the shadows like a call to arms. The old man's eyes narrowed, the lines of age and worry deepening as he stared into the night. He was no longer the man who had raised cubs with gentle hands and hopeful heart. That man had been lost somewhere between the wild and the tame, between love and the unforgiving demands of nature. Now he was something else, a guardian stripped bare, a witness to transformation, a soul standing at the edge of an abyss. The wind picked up, rattling the branches overhead and carrying with it the scent of damp earth and distant thunder. It was a storm gathering, outside and within. The old man inhaled deeply, the cold air burning his lungs, steadying his trembling hands. He rose slowly, the collar slipping from his fingers and falling silently to the ground. His eyes met the dense shadows of the forest where the wolves waited, no longer cubs, no longer bound by the ties he had forged. A quiet understanding settled over him, brittle and unyielding. The unthinkable was no longer a distant threat, but an imminent reckoning. The fragile world he had built was fracturing, and the man he had been was gone. There was no going back, only forward, into the wild unknown where hope and fear entwined in a dangerous dance. The old man took a step toward the darkness, his heart heavy but resolute. The path ahead was shrouded in mist and shadow, but it was a path he could no longer deny. And as the wolves howled again, rising in a chorus that echoed through the night, he knew that the final act had quietly begun. The first light of dawn barely pierced the dense canopy as the old man stood at the threshold of his cabin, the broken collar heavy in one hand, the other clenched tight against his chest. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving a brittle silence that hummed with an unspoken tension. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath, the shadows retreating but never quite disappearing. Today was no longer a day for hesitation. For years, he had clung to the hope that love and patience could tame wildness, that the wolves he raised were not just beasts of instinct, but extensions of himself, bound by something deeper than blood. But that fragile illusion had shattered like the collar on his floor. Now the weight of reality pressed down with relentless force. They were no longer cubs, no longer dependent, no longer the family he once knew. The wolves had grown beyond him, into something fierce, calculating, and unyielding. His eyes drifted to the forest's edge, where the silver female had vanished into the mist, her gaze still burning in his memory. She was the catalyst, the living symbol of everything that had slipped beyond his control. And yet, beneath the fear and doubt, a fierce ember of resolve sparked within him. If this was the reckoning, then he would meet it, not as a victim of circumstance, but as the man who had raised them, who had loved them fiercely, and now had to make the impossible choice. He lifted the torn collar, tracing its cracked leather with trembling fingers. It was a relic of a past that could neither protect nor imprison anymore. The bond it represented was broken, but the responsibility it symbolized had never been clearer. He would not run from the consequences, not now, not ever. A sudden rustling behind him made him spin, heart hammering. The stranger emerged from the shadows once more, eyes sharp and unreadable. "You've made your choice," the man said quietly, a hint of approval threading through the caution. "There's no turning back." The old man's voice was steady, stripped bare of pretense. "They're my family, but I won't let them become monsters. I'll face whatever comes, but on my terms." The stranger nodded slowly. "Then it's time to act. The village is restless. The hunters are gathering. The wolves are testing limits, both theirs and ours. If you wait any longer, we lose the chance to shape what happens next." Outside, the forest seemed to lean closer, the trees creaking softly, shadows lengthening as the sun struggled to break free. The old man felt the cold bite of inevitability settle over him. The wolves' howls rose faintly in the distance, a haunting chorus that spoke of power and warning, of territory carved in blood and silence. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the wild unknown. Each footfall was a declaration. He would confront the truth he had long avoided, accept the legacy he had forged with sweat and sorrow, and face the unthinkable that was no longer approaching. It was here. A sudden breeze swept through the clearing, carrying with it the scent of pine, earth, and something darker, change. The old man paused, eyes narrowing against the shifting light. Behind him, the door to the cabin swung shut with a definitive thud, sealing the past away. "Whatever happens," he whispered to the empty air, "I am still the man who raised them, and I will fight for what remains of that bond." The stranger stepped beside him, rifle lowered but ready. "Then let's begin." The forest responded with a chorus of howls, wild, fierce, and unrelenting. The net was tightening. The fragile peace was broken, and the old man's choice had set the final act in motion. There was no turning back now. The old man stood at the edge of the clearing, the cold morning wrapping around him like a shroud, thick and suffocating. The forest was unnervingly still, no rustle of leaves, no distant call of birds, just a heavy, expectant silence that pressed in from all sides. His breath came slow and shallow, each exhale a fragile mist dissolving into the cold air. The broken collar hung limp in his hand, its weight a constant reminder of the fracture between past and present. Beside him, the stranger remained silent, eyes scanning the tree line with a cautious intensity that mirrored the old man's own unease. They said nothing, yet the space between them was crowded with unspoken fears and grim anticipation. Every glance was sharp, every pause pregnant with meaning. Neither dared to break the silence, as if speaking might shatter the fragile calm before the inevitable storm. The old man's fingers clenched and unclenched around the collar, his knuckles pale beneath weathered skin. His mind raced, thoughts colliding and retreating like waves against a jagged shore. What had he truly raised? What had he unleashed? The wolves were no longer the cubs that had trusted him, no longer the creatures he thought he understood. They had become something other, something that lurked beyond the edge of his comprehension and threatened to consume everything he held dear. A distant howl pierced the quiet, low and mournful, reverberating through the hollow spaces of the forest. It was a sound both ancient and urgent, a summons and a warning. The old man's heart clenched painfully, a tight knot of dread and reluctant resolve. That cry was the herald of change, the first ripple in a tide that could not be stemmed. He swallowed hard, the taste bitter and metallic, and forced himself to breathe. The stranger shifted, breaking the spell of stillness with a subtle movement. His gaze met the old man's, searching, probing beneath the surface. "They're watching," he said softly, voice barely above the rustle of the wind. "Waiting, testing. You can feel it, can't you?" The old man nodded, unable to trust his voice. His eyes flicked to the shadows where the trees pressed close, their gnarled branches like fingers poised to grasp. The air felt charged, electric, taut, like the moment before the sky cracks open with thunder. Time seemed to warp, stretching and contracting, as if the forest itself held its breath, suspended in a fragile balance on the edge of collapse. "Is there any hope?" The question was a whisper, more to himself than to the stranger. It hung heavy between them, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The stranger's gaze hardened, a flicker of something unyielding beneath the surface. "Hope is a choice," he said, "but choices have consequences." A sudden stillness fell again, deeper and more oppressive than before. The wind stilled, the birds vanished, even the shadows seemed to freeze in place. It was as if the world had contracted into this narrow space, the clearing, the two men, the looming forest, and all that existed was the charged silence between heartbeats. The old man felt a cold sweat break across his brow, the weight of every step he had taken crashing down in an unbearable wave. His breath hitched, hands trembling, the fragile tether to his resolve fraying perilously. Somewhere beyond the trees, the wolves stirred, silent, watchful, patient, waiting for the moment to cross the line he had drawn but could no longer hold. He turned slowly, eyes scanning the dimming light filtering through the canopy. Shadows lengthened, swallowing the edges of the clearing, drawing the darkness closer like a slow tide. The barrier between what was and what was coming seemed to thin, a fragile veil threatening to tear. "Whatever happens," the old man murmured, voice tight with suppressed fear, "I won't let them." He stopped, the words choking in his throat, swallowed by the heavy stillness. The stranger's eyes met his, sharp and unwavering. "You don't have to face this alone." But the old man only shook his head, a silent admission that the path he walked was his alone to bear. The ghosts of the past, the fractured promises, the wildness that had grown beyond his reach, they all gathered like weighty shadows around his soul. The forest sighed, a breath drawn long and slow, before falling utterly silent once more. In that suspended moment, the world held its breath. The storm had not yet broken, but the first crack had appeared in the sky. And beneath it, the old man stood trembling, caught in the tightening vice of fate, love, and the unthinkable that waited just beyond the dawn. The old man's breath hitched as the cabin door slammed shut behind him, the echo rattling through the hollow space like a gunshot. His hands shook uncontrollably, the shattered collar slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floor. He crumpled against the wall, knees buckling beneath the weight of years he'd tried to carry alone. The stranger's voice cut through the storm raging inside him, sharp and unyielding. "You're not the only one who raised them," the man said, stepping forward, eyes dark with something the old man wasn't prepared to face. "It wasn't just love and care, old man. There was something else, something you buried deep." A cold sweat broke across the old man's forehead. "What are you talking about?" he rasped, voice raw and trembling. The stranger's gaze didn't waver. "You thought you were their savior, their guardian, but you were their cage. You raised them with kindness, yes, but also with fear, control, fear that twisted into something darker. You never admitted it, not even to yourself." The old man's chest tightened, a suffocating knot strangling every protest. Memories surged unbidden, nights when his hands trembled not from age but from the need to dominate, to assert a fragile hold over creatures that were never meant to be tamed. The collars, the rules, the whispered commands. They weren't just bonds of love, they were chains forged from desperation. "I did what I had to," he whispered, voice cracking, "to keep them alive. To keep myself alive." The stranger stepped closer, the firelight flickering across his face, revealing a hardness born of regret and bitter truth. "But you never saw what you were doing, did you? You thought you were building family, but you were building monsters. You tried to rewrite nature with your hands, but nature doesn't bend, it breaks." The old man's eyes filled with tears, blurring the room into a haze of shadows and shattered hopes. "I loved them," he sobbed, voice breaking free of years of restraint. "I loved them all. And now they're gone. The wolves I knew are gone." A strangled cry tore from his throat as he collapsed fully to the floor, fists pounding the cold wood like a man trying to break free from an invisible prison. "I was their keeper, their father, and I failed them. I failed myself." The stranger remained silent, letting the old man's pain fill the room like a storm unleashed. Slowly, the old man's sobs subsided into ragged breaths, his body trembling with exhaustion and despair. He looked up, eyes red-rimmed and raw, meeting the stranger's steady gaze. "They're not just wolves anymore," the stranger said quietly, voice heavy with consequence. "They're something new, something no one can control. And neither can you." The old man's gaze dropped to the broken collar, the leather frayed and stained. With a trembling hand, he reached down and crushed it into dust, the fragments scattering like the remnants of his illusion. A bitter smile twisted his lips, a grim acknowledgement that the fragile bond he'd held onto was gone, irreparably broken. "I'm not their master," he whispered, voice hoarse but resolute. "I'm their witness." Their reckoning. The weight of truth settled over him like an unbearable shroud. The man who had raised the cubs was dead, replaced by someone raw, exposed, and irrevocably changed. The wolves were no longer his to command, and the forest no longer answered to his call. Outside him the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the wolves' cries, wild, fierce, and unrelenting. The old man rose slowly, every movement heavy with finality. He stepped toward the door, pausing only to look back once at the cabin, the sanctuary that had become a tomb for his dreams. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper, "but I know I can't pretend anymore." With that, he pushed open the door and stepped into the waiting shadows, the past falling away like ash at his feet. The unthinkable had come, and there was no turning back. The old man stood at the edge of the forest once more, the dawn's pale light filtering through the skeletal branches like a tentative promise. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and damp earth, a quiet reminder that life, in its relentless way, moves forward even after the deepest storms. He clasped the broken leather collar in his hands, now fragile and worn beyond repair, its significance transformed from a symbol of control to a relic of a fractured past. His eyes, once clouded with doubt and fear, now held a quiet clarity. The weight of years and loss settled into him, not as a burden but as a testament to a journey no man could walk unscathed. He thought back to the first time he had opened that creaking door in the dawn's chill, trembling with hope and uncertainty. Then, The forest had been a place of whispered secrets and fragile trust. Now, it was a living testament to change, wild, unpredictable, and raw. He traced his fingers over the collar's cracked surface, feeling the imprint of memories once sharp and bright. Those small cubs huddled against his side, their tentative howls like a fragile echo of belonging. But he no longer sought to tame the wildness within them or himself. Instead, he understood that some bonds are meant to be honored in their breaking, that love sometimes means letting go, allowing the wild to reclaim what it must. The forest breathed around him, a slow, steady rhythm that echoed the pulse of his own heart. Somewhere deep within the shadows, the wolves moved, no longer the cubs he had raised, but creatures forged by necessity and instinct beyond his reach. He no longer believed he could command them, nor did he wish to. Their path was theirs alone, just as his was his. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, bittersweet and tentative. He remembered the whispered lullabies under the stars, the nights when the world had felt whole and safe. Those moments were not lost. They were the roots from which everything else had grown, even if the branches now stretched into unknown skies. The old man's hands trembled less now, steadied by acceptance rather than denial. He stepped forward into the clearing, the broken collar slipping from his fingers to rest upon the mossy ground. It was a quiet surrender, an offering to the earth that had witnessed his solitude and his dreams. The forest did not answer with howls or growls, but with a gentle rustling, a susurrus of leaves and wind that felt like a benediction. The old man inhaled deeply, the cold air filling his lungs with a fragile hope, not for control, not for certainty, but for understanding. The unthinkable had come and gone, reshaping him like the forest reshaped the wolves. He was no longer the man who had tried to raise cubs. He was a witness to transformation, a keeper of memories and the quiet strength found in embracing what cannot be changed. He turned his gaze skyward as the first rays of sunlight broke through the thinning mist, scattering gold across the dark soil. The world was vast, wild, and uncertain, but it was still beautiful in its rawness, still alive with possibility. "Maybe," he whispered to the empty forest, "that is enough. If you found this journey meaningful, please share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in the old man's place? Don't forget to like and subscribe to join us for more stories that explore the depths of the human heart and the wild unknown. Thank you for walking this path with us.